I'm the director of the Center for the Humanities and Public Sphere, which is part of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences here at the University of Florida. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening and for the sixth lecture of our series, Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts. With the wild ride that higher education has been taking in the state of Florida over the past several months during the state legislature's debates, it feels like an opportune time to be discussing the past, present, and future place of the humanities in higher education. As many of you know already, our aim in this series has been to create a forum with many voices in which the university members as well as community members can tackle some of the historical and contemporary tensions in the intellectual life of universities and point to the way the role of the liberal arts might develop and change in the future. Our objective in this series has not been to focus so much on the negative, while at the same time being cognizant of the current the current challenges faced by humanities disciplines, but rather to suggest some of the critical and insightful viewpoints provided by scholarship in the humanities. Our talks over the past 7 months, many of you have attended them, have focused on the issues raised by things such as religious and ethnic difference, cultural change and globalization, and the introduction of market forces into the halls of higher learning. Tonight's lecture, of course, addresses the place of disciplines such as Semitic studies, archaeology, and local history that move from the context, in many cases, of learned societies, which were essentially amateur gatherings outside of 19th century academia, into the halls of higher education. An understanding of the interaction of these so-called amateur scholars and professionalized scholars sheds light not just on the history of these humanistic fields, but also points to the important lessons that these scholars learned in negotiating between universities and the wider public interested in such subjects. Tonight's paper thus contributes to the ultimate goal of the current series, which is to provide a critical reading of universities' contributions to academic advances and public life so that we can make sense of the complex issues that are integral to the future evolution of a liberal arts education. I want to take a moment now to acknowledge the sponsorship of all of the entities and organizations that have made tonight's event possible. Many of you will be very happy to see that I'm not going to read all of our sponsors here. I've got them up on the slide. I want to draw special attention to the Alexander Grass Chair in Jewish History, which has sponsored Professor Marchand's visit here to University of Florida. I also want to extend my great thanks to Sophia Akerd, Cindy Link, Sandy James, and Chris Benura, who are helping prepare for this lecture, and all of the others that are part of our series. We've placed information just on the table over there if you'd like to sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it, or if you'd like to learn about future events. And also, we've put some snacks out if you're interested. You can help yourself. I'm especially pleased this evening to be able to welcome Professor Suzanne Marchand to Gainesville. Professor Marchand received her PhD in history in 1992 at the University of Chicago. And she's professor of history at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. Her groundbreaking research has assessed the myriad ways in which ancient culture has shaped scholarship, museums, and intellectual life in 19th and early 20th century Germany. In her first book, called Down from Olympus, Archaeology and Philhellenism in Germany from 1750 to 1950, published in 1996, Professor Marchand examined the rise of antiquarianism in Germany and the imprint left by Greek art forms and archaeology on German scholarship, art collecting, and national identity. Her second book, called German Orientalism in the Age of Empire, published just in 2010 by Cambridge University Press, has just won the American Historical Association's prestigious Georg L. Mosse Prize. Mosse Prize, traces the roots of modern Orientalism from Renaissance philology to modern universities. The book addresses landmark ideas, including a deep appreciation of Orientalist collections and art history, and the general impact of ancient Near Eastern collections on European intellectual and cultural life. Professor Marchand is also the co-editor of a work called Proof and Persuasion, Essays on Authority, Objectivity, and Evidence in 1997, and Germany at the Fin de siècle in 2004. Professor Marchand has held a number of very prestigious fellowships, including the American Council of Learned Societies Burkhardt Fellowship in 2003, the Wissenschaftskolleg Fellowship in Berlin in 2000 to 2001, and the Humboldt Fellowship in Berlin in 1997. So without further ado, I hope that you'll join me in welcoming Professor Marchand for her talk this evening entitled History and Empathy, or What We Can Learn from the Forgotten Orientalist, Georg Ebers.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. I really appreciate that lovely introduction, and I want to thank all of you for coming out on this lovely evening to hear what may or may not be a relevant talk to rehumanizing the university. I certainly hope that it will be. And thank you very much to the University of Florida, and especially to Bonnie for inviting me. It's been just a great pleasure so far. I've enjoyed everything from conversation with the graduate students to the butterflies that Jeffrey introduced me to today, which was just delightful. Now, I hope that you will, in the end, agree that delving into the forgotten world that I will explore for you tonight is relevant to the project of this lecture series, Rehumanizing the University, or perhaps maybe it might be more relevant simply to rehumanizing the humanities in one particular way, and that is to restore our empathetic understanding for the historicist scholarship, art, and literature of the 19th century. To do this seems to me to require a kind of methodological reformation, something that is, I think, in order. And here is where I start with a rather provocative introductory set of statements about methodology, and then we'll get to the more boring, arcane, and 19th century bits in a moment. It seems to me that in order to understand this almost forgotten world of the mid-19th century, what we need to do, first of all, is to finally abandon the method of discourse theory that has all but disappeared in the larger field of historical scholarship, but which still hangs its heavy drapery over the 19th century, and especially over the many disciplines and dilettantisms that Edward Said termed Orientalism. There have been many moves in this direction in recent years, but we have not yet entirely freed ourselves from what continues to be a dismal and predictable sort of intellectual history. And to that end, I begin with a brief confession and self-critique, which relates both to the problem of empathy and to the problem of understanding German Orientalism, and with it the forgotten career of the star of the paper, the philologist, travel writer, and popular novelist, Georg Ebers. So first, the confession. As a graduate student in the 1980s at the University of Chicago, I was bred a Foucaultian. And I think fondly of that time in literature still. Foucault's work taught me to take a hard look at institutions, disciplines, and discourses, and to cast a critical eye rather than a hagiographic shimmer over the knowledge of the history of knowledge production. I also owe a great debt to the work of Edward Said, who set me on a quest in the 1990s to understand German Orientalism, a subject that he had not covered in his landmark work of 1978. I learned a great deal from Foucault and Said, but one thing I did not learn was to listen to the individual voices of the past. In fact, of course, this was methodologically taboo. Indeed, I embarked on my study of German Orientalistic, quite certain that the field was to be explained by externalist pressures in politics, by Weltpolitik, and by incipient racism. Even though German study of Eastern languages predated the Reformation, and Germany had only begun trawling for overseas colonies late, in 1884, somehow I thought this had to be a story about empire and about power. After all, the 19th century was to be the main focus of the story, and I was writing, I believed, about German mandarins. What woke me from my Foucaultian reveries quite suddenly was a trivial article about a now forgotten Oriental philologist, Justus Olshausen, a man who had lost his professorship at the University of Kiel after rashly throwing in his lot with the 1848 revolutionaries. After 1849, Olshausen was forbidden from reoccupying his post and reduced to eking out a living as a librarian until his death in 1883. Although he devoted many years to the study of Indian languages, he never finished a book on the subject, as he could not satisfy himself that he'd done sufficient linguistic work to ground a major study. I think this was the sentence in an elegy written for him by a friend that got to me. Quote, "Even in the last weeks before he became fatally ill, Olshausen occupied himself with a study of sound shifts in Pahlavi." End of quote. Suddenly, I could picture a person, a lonely old man working at his desk by night, trying to get his grammar right. There were other interesting and, it seemed to me, typical things about Olshausen. His father had been a pastor. That was how Olshausen had learned to read Hebrew. He had learned little from his university professors, one of whom had refused to lecture to an audience of one, and the other of whom had been too busy with his menial library job to teach Olshausen. Olshausen's first book in 1826 had been entitled Emendations to the Old Testament. And describing his life after his passing, one friend wrote that Olshausen's life ambition had been to free the scriptures from the slag which had covered them in the course of the centuries. Quote, "First to establish the essence of Old Testament Hebraism on the basis of a text purified and fixed in this way, and then to establish its linguistic relations. That was already then his aim, and it remained his aim till the end of his life." End of quote. This Orientalist's life mission, that is to say, as understood by someone who knew him well, was consistent with that of the 16th century Christian humanists like Erasmus or even Luther himself. These biographical tidbits gave me pause, and I began to wonder if, in my rush to find an Orientalizing discourse, I'd failed to appreciate the role of religion and the way in which it continued to play a role in German scholarship, and had shut out the lived experience and explicit aims of the people who wrote, spoke, and cared most about the Orient in the 19th century. It was that point, I think, at which I came upon Lord Acton's elegant description of the typical 19th century German scholar. Quote, "Often he had risen by mere energy and conduct from crushing poverty, had gone barefoot to school, or had begged his way, like Jena professor Karl Hase, across the fatherland. And he remained frugal and austere, cultivating humble obscurity and the golden gift of silence." End of quote. Of course, this didn't describe some well-known figures like Schleiermacher or Wilamowitz, but it did describe a fair number of my Orientalists. For example, the mid-century's greatest Persian scholar, Martin Haug, whose father was a peasant farmer, quit his job as an assistant school teacher and walked 200 miles to Stuttgart with only 2 florins in his pocket. Arminius van Berry dressed as a dervish and begged his way from Istanbul to Bukhara in the 1860s, partly because he had a flair for self-dramatization and partly because he was broke. I began to notice how often my Orientalists recounted being lonely, having so few students like Friedrich Ruckert that no one noticed when they failed to show up for classes. Being teased, as was Franz Bopp, for devoting himself to anything other than classical languages. Being the only representative of the discipline in the country, as was the Egyptologist Gustav Seyffart in the 1830s or the Assyriologist Franz Delitzsch in the 1870s. There was a constant refrain. The classicists don't respect us, the theologians despise us, the public could care less about the East, unless the Old Testament is concerned. Nor was this a matter merely of intellectual marginality. Indologist Leopold von Schroeder's engagement was terminated because his prospective in-laws feared he had converted to Buddhism. The Jewish businessmen of Budapest had no interest in the scholarship of their community secretary, Ignaz Goldziher, even though he was the most highly respected Arabist in the world. Even Richard Wilhelm, whose 1924 I Ching translation remains in print today, spent the last years of his life lugging slides around Berlin, trying to convince small groups of friends that the Chinese don't eat ringworms and only in times of dire need expose their female children. Now, one shouldn't over-empathize with the Orientalist plight. By the early 20th century, they were definitely gaining positions, patrons, museum space, and even a modicum of popular appeal. Some of them were scoundrels. Some were gang-ho fans of imperialism and conquest, and some aiders and abettors of it. But Orientalists never had a fraction of the cultural clout possessed by the classicists or the standard issue liberal Protestants. They continued to be mostly interesting and useful, as Olshausen was in the beginning of his career, as interpreters of the Old Testament. That was what it was to be a German Orientalist. Now, this is a crude overview of one of the larger and I hope more subtle arguments in my book, but I hope I can now draw out one of the major lessons I learned. Construing the pursuit of knowledge as a purely political act, a quest for some sort of power, wipes out the deep and abiding power of religious questions and humanistic practices in the history of scholarship. It constructs, often arbitrarily, rules of discourse which distort the intentions and idiosyncrasies of individual producers of knowledge. There is a deep hubris embedded in the Foucaultian and Saidian readings of the 19th century in particular, one that says that we understand better what they cared about than they did, and one that gives us the right to pick out random passages, and if we are so inclined, to perform the historiographical equivalent of shooting fish in a barrel. This sort of hegemony critique that makes every person who uses the term Oriental or even dark just as guilty of propagating empire as Lord Curzon simply doesn't work, and moreover yields deeply unfair results. We end up indicting those who actually learned Oriental languages and tried to understand Asian cultures from within, rather than, for example, the classicists who blithely insisted Greece and Europe were superior. End of discussion. We also end up indicting individuals for reproducing stereotypes or prejudices found in their sources. This is a problem I will call, after Sheldon Pollock, the problem of deep Orientalism. And I can assure you it is a humanistic problem par excellence, as being true to our sources is our first and greatest commitment and commandment as humanists. Now, it is harder to do, this differentiating between Europeans, this assessing of actual reception, this listening to what the ancient sources actually say, but isn't that what historians are supposed to do? Work hard to understand their subjects. Discourse theory, I've decided, is for the angels, who have read everything and thus can distill the rules based on knowing all that was said. Or it's for philosophers who want us to see the Enlightenment upside down, as imprisonment rather than liberation. Being neither angels nor philosophers, we intellectual historians are better off without it. Now, one final point before I get off my theoretical soapbox. I particularly think that the 19th century needs to slough off this discursive coil, as it is killing our interest and that of our students in a world that is rich with contradictions and conflicts, but which discourse theory presents as undifferentiatedly racist and repressive. It was perhaps necessary to go through the Foucaultian mangle to wring out our remaining cheerfulness about 19th century progress, but we have left ourselves with a lifeless remnant. The only interest remains in finding the garment's remaining rips and stains. To switch metaphors, too few of us now speak about the glass half full: abolitionism, expansion of suffrage, religious toleration, prison reform, child labor laws, rising literacy, expanding accessibility of cultural institutions. How frequently today do we describe Flaubert's brilliant wit as opposed to his denigration of Orientals, or the extraordinary talents of Mendel, Trollope, Turgenev, Delacroix, or Dostoevsky? Doesn't it seem old-fashioned or even embarrassing to say nice things about the 19th century now, to give it credit for anything except for ramping up imperialism and inventing genocide? I actually think this could be less true of German historians than of French and British historians, but I'm worried about the vilification of this century and its consequences, one of which is that ever more of our students and younger colleagues avoid studying it at all. Now, I will get to my case study, which I hope will show that what we thought we knew about Orientalism explains very little of what some Orientalists were actually like and what their reception actually meant. My subject is Georg Ebers, a good test case, as he was both a professional Egyptologist and a highly successful popularizer of things Egyptian. In addition to specialized scholarship, he wrote a series of historicizing novels, the first Baedeker Guide to Egypt, and one of the great, if forgotten, illustrated travelogues of the later 19th century, Ägypten in Bild und Wort, or Egypt in Pictures and Words. Ebers is one of those individuals whose career and work is indeed weirder and rather more lonely than we might have thought, although he belonged to the age of hypercolonization, and it surely touched him in some ways. But trying to make sense of him in purely Saidian terms would not only destroy his individuality and distort the meaning of his work, but would obscure some important changes going on in the history of scholarship in his era. Restoring the individuality of someone like Ebers to the history of ideas, on the other hand, might tell us something about the circulation of ideas about Egypt amongst the wider German public at the fin de siècle. So here first is a bit more background on Ebers. Ebers was, unlike some of our lonely Orientalists, in having a relatively privileged upbringing. His father, a Jewish convert to Christianity, was a wealthy banker and a leading member of Berlin society. His mother was a pious Dutch Calvinist, something that gave Ebers a particularly deep sympathy for the Old Testament, but which didn't prevent her from inviting Hegel to her whist parties. Georg Ebers was born in March 1837, 2 weeks after his father's death. This made him his mother's consolation, and I believe deepened his sentimentality. He died in 1898, which places him squarely in the high liberal and Grecophile generation of the Gründerzeit. In this era, even the Orientalists believed that the ancient Greeks had created the most beautiful artistic monuments and were in bodily form the most beautiful race, though as we shall see, Ebers also found considerable beauty amongst the Egyptians, Persians, early Christians, and Jews. As a boy, he preferred Homer to the 1001 Nights, but he also heard intriguing stories about Japan and Java from the letters of his uncles who served in the Dutch colonial service. And you see, I don't deny that colonialism had at least tangential import for people like Ebers. He set out to study law at the University of Göttingen, but was sidetracked by other things, including the history of art, in which context he first and importantly encountered things Egyptian, and we'll come back to that in a moment. He determined to pursue Egyptology, though this turned out to be a more demanding calling than he expected. His mother's friend Jakob Grimm demonstrated both his keen assessment of the German scholarly community and his absurd ignorance of things Egyptian by instructing Ebers that studying hieroglyphics alone would make him merely a dragoman, that is, a translator, chiefly to the Sultan's court. Hieroglyphics, of course, would not have done him any good in that capacity. Thus, Ebers set about improving his Greek and Latin and learning Italian, English, Hebrew, and some Sanskrit, as well as hieroglyphics, hieratic, and demotic. By the way, he could not have taken courses on modern Arabic or modern Asian history or culture at all at the university. They simply weren't offered. Ebers had to work from his bed as he had contracted some sort of a virus during his university years. It's a testimony to the humanity and to the relative lack of other duties of his Egyptological mentor, Karl Richard Lepsius, that Lepsius came to tutor Ebers at his home every Thursday for a long period of time. It is also telling about the state of Egyptology in the 1860s, when Ebers wrote his habilitation, that he was unable to write what he wanted to write, a history of Egypt in the era of Cambyses, because so much about the period, especially from the Egyptian side, seemed uncertain in the wake of Champollion's deciphering of hieroglyphics. A lot simply had not been read or written or printed. It was still a very uncertain time. In fact, the whole translation and decipherment was still somewhat in question. Ebers longed to write a study on the model of Jakob Burckhardt's Constantine the Great, but he was warned by his fellow Egyptology student Edward Meyer, quote, that it was not yet possible to write a conclusive history which would be able to hold up against criticism about precisely that era, end of quote. Ebers knew that Meyer was right, and so he made a daring decision for a German scholar in the era of high positivism. He would write a novel instead. Ebers justified to himself his indulgence in the frivolous pastime of writing fiction by restricting himself to only working on the novel in the evenings, when, owing to his illness, he couldn't go out as did other young men. He would write the novel for his mother, not for cash or for fame. Indeed, when he showed the first draft of an Egyptian princess to Lepsius, his mentor, the venerable philologist responded, "Aber ich bitte Sie," or the equivalent of, "oh, please," and he referred to it as an extravagance. But eventually he pardoned his student on the grounds of his illness. Ebers tried to please Lepsius too. He dedicated an Egyptian princess to his mentor and flooded its pages with more than 500 footnotes, explaining to readers such things as Egyptian reverence for cats and Persian horticulture. Naturally, Ebers' philological colleagues read only these notes and delighted in exposing his errors. But the novel proved to be a popular success. In fact, by 1880 it was in its 9th edition, and by 1906 it had appeared in 17 languages, including Arabic. But perhaps the scholarly assault, or Lepsius's disapproval, caused Ebers for a time to stop writing fiction. He returned to it only in the later 1870s, when his illness flared up, forcing him to trim back his teaching and traveling, and to seek other forms of occupation and consolation. In this later period, he produced one more heavily footnoted novel, Uarda, of 1875, followed by a series of other novels set for the most part in Hellenistic or Old Testament Egypt. After Uarda, he cut back to occasional footnotes, but he did not give up his attempt to carefully weave his stories around real events and to give his characters realistic features, habits, surroundings, and motivations. Now, I want to cite for you some of the statements Ebers makes in the preface of An Egyptian Princess, just to tell you a little bit about what this novel is like. He acknowledges that he has had to use his imagination to fill in the gaps in the historical record, and that the sentimentality and Christian beliefs of a, quote, native of the world of the 19th century are bound to be evident to some acute readers. He feels that his readers will find it more easy to understand the Persians and Greeks, quote, being by descent related to ourselves, than to identify with the Egyptians, quote, whose dwelling place was on the fruitful islands won by the Nile from the desert, completely isolated from the rest of the world. He also acknowledges that, at Lepsius's suggestion, he has allowed his readers to enter through a, quote, Hellenic portico in the form of an invented Greek salon hostess named Rodolphus, a character based on Ebers' mother, and only one of Ebers' many images of intellectual women in his novels. Lepsius, he wrote, had warned him, quote, that a tale confined entirely to Egypt and Egyptians might become wearisome, end of quote. But Ebers says, quote, it has been my desire that the three nations, Egypt, Persia, and Greece, should attract the reader equally, and I have therefore not centered the entire interest of the plot in one hero, but have endeavored to exhibit each nation in its individual character by means of a fitting representative, end of quote. I would say that overall this is Ebers' method in his novels. The books consistently interweave the so-called races or nations of the ancient Orient, and the leading characters tend to typify what might be said to be national traits. But where do these national traits come from? As a rule, they come from the ancient sources. In An Egyptian Princess set in the era of Croesus, Darius, and Pharaoh Amasis II, they come chiefly from Herodotus. In Joshua of 1889, they come from the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua. In Cleopatra of 1894, they come from Plutarch. There's a kind of deep Orientalism here, a pre-structuring of the stories and characters by the ancient texts in which they are first described. These are historicizing novels, after all. They want to take on historical coloring and exactitude. But when we look closely at these characterizations, we can see that Ebers, in fact, softens ancient verdicts, especially on his Oriental characters. Joshua, in his eponymous novel, ever holds dear the beautiful Egyptian woman who sacrifices herself to save him from the mines. One will look in vain for such ecumenicism in the Old Testament. Ebers' Cleopatra is less Plutarch's seductress or Shakespeare's fertility goddess than a wise, patriotic, and passionate ruler, and above all, a loving mother. She is beautiful, of course, perhaps more so for not being fully Greek. In all of his novels, Ebers gives roundness to the Egyptian characters, reiterating frequently his view that the Egyptians, quote, were no nation of grim pedants, but excitable, prone to joyous festal mirth, keen witticisms, and passionate grief, end of quote. Ebers' novels emphasize the distribution of virtues across all races. There are corrupt and irrational Greeks. There are greedy and bloodthirsty as well as godly Jews. There are disloyal and cruel as well as kind and chaste Egyptians. This clearly came through to his readers, most of whom, it turns out, were young women. There were parodies of Ebers, such as a play called Memphis in Leipzig, and many tributes, such as an 1887 hagiography cum analysis of the novels by Halle professor Richard Gosche, which underscored Ebers' ability to humanize the Egyptians as well as antiquity's other peoples. Quote, through their profound empathy, Gosche concluded, these novels have made Egypt part of the pageant of humanity forever, end of quote. Gosche may have gushed, but his discourse needs to be taken seriously too. Now, a Pharaoh-sized part of Ebers' empathy was his refusal to wear religious prejudices on his sleeve. Rather than ridiculing the customs and beliefs of any sect, Ebers simply tries to explain them and positively inflects characters who are loyal to their gods, whoever those gods may be. One might say that his treatment of his characters reflects a worldview akin to the one Lessing expressed in Nathan the Wise. In Ebers, too, there's a strong streak of anti-clericalism, but empathy for ordinary believers of all types. He has his good Egyptian pharaoh Amasis II say, quote, "What has been sung to us in our childhood and praised as sacred in our youth lingers on in the heart until the day which sees us embalmed as mummies," end of quote. And speaking of embalmers, Ebers' Uarda draws on the Ebers Papyrus, a series of documents Ebers found, which I'll describe later, draws on this papyrus to tell the story of a child of an embalmer who belongs to an untouchable clan, the Perishites. Ebers uses her story to condemn religious and caste prejudice, and remarkably, by the end of the novel, Uarda is not only allowed to be touched, but to marry the pharaoh's son, though this is also made possible by the discovery that her mother was a Greek princess. It's a complicated plot. Ebers' ecumenicism is on full display in his novel Joshua, which opens not with the condemnation of Pharaoh's hard heart, but with a moving description from an Egyptian perspective of the slaughter of Egypt's innocents. Now, this is not to say there's no subtle bias or stereotyping in the novels. One does feel that Ebers more fully inhabits the hearts of his Greek and perhaps his Jewish characters, though I would like to emphasize that this is made more fully possible by the fact that the Greek and Jewish sources offer far more explicit detail on the interior lives of individuals of the ancient world, again, something that relates to our deep Orientalism theme. He obviously approves of Joshua's return to his people after his long service in Pharaoh's army, and Ebers often also invents for Joshua a dream in which he foresees what is clearly the appropriate supersessionary antidote to the noble but severe Jewish law, Christ's message of love, mercy, and redemption. Ebers' stories feature educated and beautiful but dutiful women. Nietzsche unkindly but rather accurately described Ebers' characters as, quote, daughters of Leipzig professor in Egyptian dress, end of quote. The patriarchal message is clear in Joshua, where the prophetess Miriam, Moses' sister, tells her husband Hur what to do and is punished and shamed into silence. But of course, the Old Testament and Egyptian texts were already deeply patriarchal, and within these constraints, as well as the constraints of the genre of the romance novel, Ebers' women come off remarkably strong and intelligent. It is as if, and this is the key message I want to get across, Ebers understands his own prejudices as well as those of his sources and his contemporaries, and is trying to counter them, without, however, violating too flagrantly what he sees as the historical record, respectable behavior, and bearing or common sense. Now, there's an interesting link between Ebers' attempts to subtly overturn prejudices and the aspect of ancient Egypt that first drew him to the subject, art. Repeatedly, Ebers condemns his contemporaries for making sense of Egypt and Egyptians exclusively by comparing their art to the more familiar and more revered arts of the Greeks. This, of course, is a prejudice that goes back to Winckelmann and beyond, but Ebers will have none of it. Quote, "From studying the conventional mode of execution of ancient Egyptian art, which was strictly subject to the hieratic laws of type and proportion," he writes, "we have accustomed ourselves to imagine the inhabitants of the Nile Valley in the time of the pharaohs as tall and haggard men with little distinction of individual physiognomy. This is an error. The Egyptians, in spite of their aversion to foreigners and their strong attachment to their native soil, were one of the most intellectual and active peoples of antiquity. And he who would represent them as they lived, and to that end copies the forms which remain painted on the walls of the temples and sepulchres, is the accomplice of those priestly corrupters of art who compelled the painters and sculptors of the pharaonic age to abandon truth and nature in favor of their sacred laws of proportion." He continues, "He who desires to paint the ancient Egyptians with truth and fidelity must regard it in some sorts of ways as an act of enfranchisement. That is to say, he must release the conventional forms from those fetters which were peculiar to their art and altogether foreign to their real life." End of quote. Ebers, that is, feels that he is working against the ways in which the actual artistic works of ancient Egypt lend themselves to demeaning racial typing or to stereotyping. That is to say, he is fighting deep Orientalism with modern Orientalist scholarship, trying to work against a comparison that was always drawn in this way between a supposed individualistic, lifelike Greece and a stereotypical unhuman or individualized Egypt. Ebers waged this battle, I believe, on yet another front, and that is that of the travelogue, another of the key genres with which recent scholars have found many links to the business of Orientalizing. Ebers' travelogues do not fit Said's model and should be taken seriously as exceptions. They include Germany's first Baedeker for Egypt, a 670-page and highly popular Cicerone, given a Burkhardian title, but by no means a Burkhardian Eurocentric content, and the lavish coffee table book to which I want to turn in a moment, Ebers' lavish Egyptian in Bild und Wort. Now here too, Ebers surprises us and deserves to speak in his own terms. I want to tell you now the history of this lavish coffee table book. I didn't bring my picture of what it looks like. It was a 2-volume set, huge format, studded with aquamarine jewels, extremely lavish production, produced in 1879, 1880. First, let me give you a little bit of background before that came out. Ebers had traveled to Egypt and the Near East in 1869-70 and visited again in 1872. During the second trip, he found and purchased the text subsequently known as the Ebers Papyrus, one of the most important medical treatises of the ancient Near East. But he had also become interested in art and become a close friend of the then Egyptizing Dutch-English painter Lawrence Alma Tadema, whose 1872 The Egyptian Widow and another, I want to show you, the Joseph, Overseer of Pharaoh's Granaries, were produced in the 1870s and share an archaeological and sentimental view very much with Ebers' Egyptian Princess. And indeed, the two became friends in the 1870s and shared much in common. This painting is highly dramatic. There's also another one I didn't show you because it's very dark. That's a Death of the Firstborn that's very resonant with the opening of Ebers' Joshua novel. Very emotional. The figures are very much given their own individuality and mourning. And indeed, Alma Tadema's picture was done after the death of one of his own children. So it's even more meaningful that he's putting into these Egyptian pictures a tremendous amount of sentiment of his own. Now, it's not clear who approached whom, but by the mid-1870s, Ebers was working on the first Baedeker Guide to Egypt, the first volume of which appeared in 1877. While negotiations over that second volume continued, Ebers put together a team to produce a much more lavish travelogue, the 2-volume Egyptian in Bild und Wort. For this project, Ebers engaged Adolf Gnauf to coordinate the art program, and Gnauf in turn deputized the lonely Austrian Orientalist painter Karl Leopold Müller to organize a sojourn in Egypt for a group of painters. This group, which included Hans Makart and the portraitist Franz von Lenbach, spent the summer of 1876-7 in Egypt, something for Germans in particular that was still a very avant-garde thing to do. The trip yielded, amongst many other paintings, Makart's own envisioning of an Egyptian princess, and that's this slide, and the Cleopatra was done actually on Makart's return home and is much more in the style of the European Orientalist paintings of the day, I think even than the Egyptian princess or most of the rest of the paintings and pictures in Egyptian in Wort. When Egypt in Pictures appeared in 1879-80, it featured some 745 engravings and turquoise-studded covers. It was quickly translated into numerous languages. Ebers wrote the whole text, though he did thank friends for their help. One of these was, interestingly, the still very young and very lonely Hungarian Jew Ignaz Goldseer, who would later become Europe's greatest fin de siècle Arabist and one whose work is still esteemed throughout the world today. Goldziher had been Ebers' student, but effectively was no one in 1878, but his Islamophile stance clearly suited Ebers and made its way into the pages of this high bourgeois coffee table book. Now, Ebers clearly thought of Egypt in pictures as something like a cross between his Baedeker and his novels. The text and the images focus on the modern world, but occasionally invoke the ancient one. The purpose of the book, he says, and note I don't dismiss what he says, was to present, quote, everything that is beautiful and admirable, that which is artistically powerful, which appears unique and charming in ancient and modern Egypt for readers of today and tomorrow, end quote. Of course, I think we can go a bit beyond that and particularly take apart the word charming, or entzückend, but first let's look at a few of the images. Like the historicizing paintings of Alma Tadema, some of which appear as engravings in Ebers' book, the images seem designed to edify and not to titillate. This makes the art program of the book distinctively different, I would argue, from the Orientalizing painting of his contemporaries in France and England. And I have a couple of comparisons there. This is Ebers' bath and Ingres' bath. This is the harem of Jerome and the harem of Ebers. And this is just a portrait of a young follower of the prophet in the Ebers collection. Ebers' book portrays modern Egypt as a land of diverse settings, urban and rural, private and public, modernized and ancient, and of people who may look and dress differently than Europeans, but who by no means lack individuality, sense, skill, or virtue. Like the images, the text of Egyptian pictures and words does not depict the East as inhabited exclusively or even heavily by overly sensual women and fanatical or indolent men. And that's the women at the well. This is the El Azhar, which I think is a rather sympathetic treatment and not a particularly derogatory one. Nor are Muslim Egyptians portrayed as ignoramuses, uninterested in their own history. They are, on the whole, bourgeois or proto-bourgeois citizens. Note in this image that among the women scrutinizing ancient sculptures outside the Cairo Museum, there are both women in Egyptian or in European dress and women wearing the veil. And all of them are coming to look and pay their respects to the Egyptian sculptures. Now, Ebers was not cut from the same cloth as many of his fellow philologists and archaeologists, men who immersed themselves in the ancient world and despised the modern Orient. Indeed, Ebers' reading of the modern Egyptian situation seems to me remarkably fair-minded for his day. He tried to give Muhammad Ali and Khedive Ismail a fair shake, arguing that the former tried to modernize his nation, but his success was impeded by his own impatience. Ismail, who had just been driven into exile in 1879, Ebers acknowledged had been corrupt, but had also abolished slavery and spent generously on telegraphs, sanitation, railroads, public education, and the conservation of antiquities. Europeans, he lectured, ought to judge him according to these fruits of his reign. He thought the new Khedive actually highly promising. Throughout his travelogue, Ebers distinguishes between types of Islamic worshippers. As in every religion, he writes, there are some who are superstitious and some who are highly learned. With the help of Goldziher, he wrote admiringly about the El Azhar, where over the so-called Barbarians' Gate into the university complex, the inscription reads, quote, the deeds will be judged by their ways of thinking, and every man's reward will be measured by his ways of thought, end of quote. This, to Ebers, encapsulated modern Islam's nobility. There were problems with mosque schools, he averred, but those did not stem from the mixing of science and faith. Unified secular and religious education was, for Muslims, the means to obtaining the most noble human nature, something he does not parody or make fun of in the least. The problem was not Islam, but interference on the part of stupid princes who were trying to politicize and rob the mosques. For the travails of the modern Middle East, he did not blame Orientals in general, but a few bad eggs or bad decisions, and the Europeans. In the foreword to Egyptian Pictures, Ebers writes, after the age of the pharaohs came, quote, the rule of the relentlessly changing Islam. And relentlessly changing, it's not static at all. Today, a ruler sits on the throne of Egypt who has made the success of European culture useful to his Muslim people. But also the painted and promiscuous daughter of the culture of the West, the so-called civilization, has made its way into Egypt with its hatred for the unique and its desire for merciless homogenization, and is robbing the alleys and plazas in the villages and cities of the magic of their own particular style, one that grew organically from the soul of the Orient. Western civilization is forcing its ways into the houses and putting in the place of old stately divisions of space, the most thrifty and modest use of it. It strips the men of the local splendor of the robes and decorated weapons and makes women want the more revealing clothes of their envied European sisters. The whistle of the locomotive chases through the fertile fields and deserts, mocking the patient carrying power of the camels. All of the uniqueness of the Orient, the great as in the small, is being driven out and fades more and more and threatens in the course of a few years to disappear entirely. End of quote. Now there is more than a whiff of primitivizing romanticism here, a lament that the still half-biblical Orient is being destroyed by European modernization and is destroying the charming simplicity and uniqueness of the Orient. And there is a longing here for the East to remain different so that it will suit European tastes for the picturesque. But even so, this was hardly a set of observations useful for those Europeans who certainly existed, Ebers says so himself, who wished to command and exploit Egypt to their own ends. Now, Ebers remained a liberal with largely bourgeois cosmopolitan views. Although he learned hieroglyphics and participated in what I've called the Second Oriental Renaissance, his scholarly perspective was still shaped very much by Greek and biblical sources. It's telling, for example, that he found biblical higher criticism unpalatable, and along with the Christian archaeologist Edouard Neville, very much thought that the new archaeology and philology proved rather than disproved the historical accuracy of the Old Testament. But by the mid-1880s, both the scholarly and the liberal world in which Ebers came of age were passing. His own student, Adolf Ehrmann, would criticize the very texts on which Ebers relied, Herodotus, the Old Testament, and Wilkinson's Manners and Customs of the Ancient Egyptians, arguing in 1886 that these should be seen as no more credible than modern tourist literature written by English lords and American ladies. Born in the 1860s rather than the 1830s, Adolf Ehrmann had none of Ebers' sentimentality and was the far better scholar. But he too struggled to convince his contemporaries that ancient Egypt was anything like as important as ancient Greece, something on which Lawrence Alma Tadema struggled and then gave up. And I just wanted to show you another one of Alma Tadema's early Egyptian pictures, and then show it side by side with the classicizing pictures, with far more nudity, by the way, that he began to paint after the 1880s in the classical vein. These were far, far more successful and marketable, the naked classicizing pictures, than the Egyptian pictures. And Alma Tadema largely gave up painting anything having to do with Egypt after that time. In some respects, in fact, after the time of Ebers, his fellow scholars had more and more trouble convincing the public to be interested in Egypt, to care about the world that he had led them to sympathize with, had led at least some of those daughters of professors to care about. It became harder and harder once that Hellenic portico was dismissed, once the biblical resonances died away. Perhaps Lepsius had been right. The public grew bored of Egypt for its own sake rather than for the sake of this larger tradition. But was that really the fault of the Orientalists? Perhaps in part, but also in part it was the result of other modernizing changes, which included school reform, the decline of the biblical narrative, the rise of modern anti-Semitism, modernism in art and literature, and imperialism. All of those forces contributed, I think, to a movement away from the world of Ebers and towards something very different. Ebers' career demonstrates that there was a moment, however, in the history of Orientalist scholarship and the history of Germany and the history of the 19th century, in which well-bred young ladies read about romances in ancient Egypt and Judea and did not feel that this world was utterly alien from their own. There was a time in which rich bourgeois readers leafed through Egypt in pictures and words and saw sympathetic as well as primitivizing images of Egypt. Ebers' readers, steeped in the Old Testament and in Greek literature, still felt a connection to this world, and Ebers sought to enhance this by seeking, in his words, to, quote, clothe the hardly earned results of severer studies in an imaginative form, end of quote. We could surely fixate on certain passages in the novels in which a Nubian maid is described as, quote, the ugliest woman in the world, or Greek skin is compared to alabaster, but this hardly seems fair. Can we think ourselves back into this age in which intellectuals cared about the ancient world and humankind's religious histories, and in which imperial cupidity and racist ideas coexisted with sentimental and patriarchal, but nonetheless real attempts to understand others? I hope we can, and I hope we will make that leap and recognize that the 19th century, like the 21st century, and like Ebers' ancient and modern Egypt, contained a variety of characters, some of whom, at least, attempted to transcend the prejudices of their day. It is time we gave up trying to force everyone, even all the inhabitants of the now despised later 19th century, into the same discursive bag. Perhaps we should take a cue from Ebers and from the inscription on the barbarian's gate and recommit ourselves to the motto, by their fruits and their particular ways of thought shall you know them. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. You want to
Yeah, I think we
field
have
it?
time for questions if anybody would like to pose a question to Professor Marchand.
Yep.
Reputation seems to have declined, you call it forgotten. And I'm wondering if this perhaps happened after the Second World War. I got home this afternoon, I pulled some German encyclopedias off my bookshelf and noticed that he ranks in the Meyer's Konversationslexikon of 1894 a whole column, half a page. By 1955, he gets 3 lines. But I'm interested also in what reception he might have had in the Third Reich. I looked at a couple of other encyclopedias at home, and whereas in 1932, in Der große Herde, he is described as overrated as a novelist. He actually gets a slightly longer entry in the only encyclopedia that was published during the Third Reich in 1937. It's also the only one that describes him as Jewish. Of course, it doesn't say anything particularly with any value judgment, but it does give him a dozen lines or so and accepts him as a noted scholar and novelist. So I wonder what happened.
What's the trajectory? My sense is that he was already really weird, old-fashioned for your, really old aunt by the 1920s. So even, earlier, his work is very clearly just that 19th century historicism with lots of detail, really not very fast-moving, fast-paced stuff. So I think it was already fading in importance, though there are some new additions in the 1920s. I'm very interested to hear what you're saying. I'll see what I can find out about the Third Reich, but I think by then he was already pretty much something you might find in a dusty corner of somebody's house. But, in the his high water mark was in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, and then it was apparently common to give copies of his work for Christmas and birthday presents, particularly to young women. And once Karl May got into fashion, this was the ladies' Karl May. They were reading this, and their brothers were reading Karl May. So it's a pretty clear trajectory. One thing I think is kind of interesting as sort of a parallel, I think that you might find an interesting kind of similarity to some of the artistic historicizing painting, too, that it just really goes out of fashion very fast, maybe even 1905, 6, 7. one sees this, for example, in the work of Arnold Böcklin, the mythologizing painter. He was everybody's famous painter in the 1890s, and by 1910, it's like, ugh. Except, of course, Hitler loved him. So some people have very, old tastes. Thank you. Yeah.
I just want to follow up on the question. Do you have any evidence that he was Jewish? And if so,
He certainly was not religiously Jewish. His father was definitely Jewish, but his father converted to Christianity. So his father was part of the circle of Mendelssohn and all of these people, Neander and so on in Berlin, a very high-profile literary circle. But his father died 2 weeks after Ebers' birth, so Ebers never knew his father and never, was part directly of any sort of Jewish tradition having to do with his father's life, because he had converted. I think at the time he married his mother. So the family knew, he knew that there was a Jewish part of the family. He was always rather sympathetic to Jewish students, quite sympathetic. He took in Goldziher and was extremely kind to him, and was very kind to a number of his other Jewish students. But he was not a practicing Jew himself ever. Yeah.
He was certainly read by a lot of females. Did he influence any female novelists that you can pinpoint?
I don't know of any. I would love to know about that, but I've not seen anyone. I think because also the genre was about to die, by the time he got around to it. But if he did, it would be not high-level novelists also that we know about, innovative, modern people. It would be romance novels. I mean, these are really romance novels in many ways. They're historicizing romance novels. I finally had that revelation at a certain point after reading a certain number of them. That's what this is about. Yeah.
There is also, and she, one of the few novels, I forget exactly, but she traveled to the Orient, and she's extremely critically massive about Oriental women. It's like if she saw all those pictures of beautiful women, really was reminiscing for those very nasty things about her. This is very vague, but this is what I remember about her. Female authors. But I was interested in your comments about the older literary tradition in Germany, in which the Orientalists, they call it Goethe, Mr. Divan, really emphasized romantics, Schlegel, he mentioned this of India and all this. And you have many fairy tales about the Oriental powers. Are the differences between his historical novels informed by his history and the earlier poetic
reworking? That's an interesting and a rich question, which I'm not sure how much of I can answer because I don't know enough, but there are also a number of ways into this. There was a tradition, I'm sure you know about this, starting with Herder, called Nachdichtung, which is a sort of composing in the mode of. And Herder himself did this, composed in the mode of the Orient, tried to compose poems that would be like Persian poetry. Goethe did this precisely in the Westostliche Divan. And there were, in those traditions, also very serious scholarship going on. Friedrich Ruckert, who did a lot of this, was a serious Orientalist himself, and did a lot of his work, we think, really as preparation for writing a poem. In fact, also it seems that Friedrich Schlegel's big essay on the wisdom of the Indians was probably a preparatory to a new translation of the Shakuntala. That's probably what he wanted. So at that level, what was the highest? It wasn't the scholarly work, it was the poetry, and you did the poetry in order to get to the scholarship. In the case of Ebers, he's clearly not a terrifically gifted literary person, and he's not reworking Oriental traditions or poems or, it's not inspiring to him in that way, in an imaginative way in terms of method or style or breaking through new pathways. It's to him a content, it's a story, it's a setting. It's more like Bulwer-Lytton than it is like Goethe or Ruckert. So there are, I think, interesting linkages in this desire to really go back and understand it, to use the scholarship as part of your vehicle for conveying the story, but it's not innovative in a literary fashion. And that's not the Orient is not that. It's not thinking the Orient in order to do something innovative. Yeah.
You said getting away from discourse theory, you were able to see how much religion influences these Orientalists. If you could sort of tease that out a little bit more, and also point out if you see some sort of generational divide where religion isn't as influential suddenly, or if that sort of narrative of religion kind of going away is kind of more blurry than the narrative would suggest.
The question of when it goes away is a really tricky, difficult one, because it sometimes gets sort of reprocessed. So it's there, but it's in a more abstracted form. And I would say that this transition that I described at the end between Ebers and Ehrman is a very significant one. Though I think Ehrman takes over what really is a very long-term Protestant biblical scholarly narrative and puts it into a different frame. But Ehrman is not any longer interested in the Old Testament as a revealed text or as a religious text. He's interested in it as a purely historical text. So there's still some religious content to it, although for Ebers it's not about proving it's true or even proving it's false. It's about simply what you can use of it as a historical document. As for the discourse theory question, I think one of the problems with a lot of them, for me anyway, with the discourse theory, and I struggle with this because it's still very useful in a lot of respects, but one of the problems is that it prioritizes politics as the thing that drives us. It's the thing that makes you what you are, defines your identity, is being a European as opposed to an Easterner. It's a political narrative. It's defined by the imperial experience, and so on. And it seems to me, and Said nicely at the beginning of Orientalism lays out the earlier framework that really was a religious one, and then he sort of forgets about it, and it doesn't exist anymore. And that means that you are left with a purely political division into these two entities, and it just simply doesn't work for the people I'm talking about. It doesn't define who they are, how they associate themselves. Some of them really associate themselves very closely with either Jews or with Indians. They have all sorts of other things going on. It's just not at all easy to use that paradigm to understand what these people are really internally upset about or trying to work out for themselves. So it's helpful in some respects, and it's very helpful also for understanding the popular discourse in a lot of ways, but it's all too easy to abuse, to just take some pieces of text and put them together and create a kind of binary system that doesn't really, it seems to me, get at some of the deeper stuff. It's also the case that the whole paradigm doesn't work nearly as well for Germany, Holland, Russia, Hungary, as we were discussing earlier today in your project. It just doesn't work for those in the same way at all, or Greek or Italian Orientalism. And all of these things are really important contributors to the wider discourse, so that it just, I think, at the end of the day, makes it more difficult to work through. Now, having said that, I think we had to do that first. I mean, I still am very grateful to Said for laying out the groundwork and giving us a model to work with. But I think it's time to step back from it and try to do something else. Yeah?
So I was wondering if you could talk a little about the visual source material. In part because, quite frankly, and I think the juxtaposition is film is absolutely appropriate. But there's also a Jean student in the UK who offers a really interesting model of a kind of self-orientalizing remote observation and emergence from the scientific attempt at almost either a graphical or a reconstructive, archaeological version.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, that stuff was shown in 67 and 1964. And I'm wondering if there's, just in terms of, there was this being published, through the Ebers, if there were photographic sources that were used in positions and so forth. I mean, I'm wondering if you can comment on the ways in which recent popular images that you showed come into precisely what's going on in this sort of crisis moment, trying to find precisely what you described, backdrops to motivate this sort of, I would almost describe this desire of quality to build up home that
Never existed.
is kind of like describing this as a template. The kind of homesickness that
Yeah.
we sit in the 19th century and this,
Kind of home. Yeah. Certainly, part of it is a search, I think, for a kind of integrity, a communal integrity. It's a kind of romantic longing for a world that's still untouched by modern technology and city life. And there's a certain amount of that kind of what I call primitivizing romanticism. Certainly, that's part of it. As far as I know, that project was done mostly just from sketches made in Egypt. I'm sure there may have had some photographs, but I don't know that for sure. Some things were done at home. Some of McCart's paintings were done in the studio, and like the Cleopatra was done in the studio, not in Egypt. I think the Egyptian princess might have been done in Egypt, but not the Cleopatra. But the engravers and painters were, for the most part, not people who were very well known. They were younger people, but they ended up doing a lot of other Orientalist painting of various sorts or engravings of various types. But they never, one of the things, of course, I don't really know how to understand this. The Germans were not big on nudity in any of their 19th century paintings that I know of. I mean, maybe somebody knows, until you get to the fin de siècle. And these were paintings for bourgeois people, not for aristocratic people on the whole. They tended to, when they did Orientalist paintings, they also, many of them, at least for a while, tended to have a religious content. But I don't know much more than that. It's not a genre that's very well studied yet, and I think we need a whole lot more, inquiry to understand these images. But there are a ton of them in this volume. It's just enormously lavish, illustration on every page, basically. Any other questions?
Following up on Joyce's question, I'm curious to know more about the subject matter. How Ebers chose certain storylines to follow. Imagination there.
Yeah. Again, I don't know how he chose them. They tend to be pretty conventional, stories that, the Cleopatra, Joshua. Okay, I'm trying to think back to some of these other ones that are not so conventional. Uarda is a very unconventional story that he basically made up. And it has to do with this untouchable girl who comes from this Egyptian caste of embalmers. But that one was partly a vehicle to show off his papyrus. He'd found this fabulous Ebers papyrus, which is one of the great, medical papyri in existence. And it had all of this information about doctors and embalmers and magic and so on. So he wanted to use that in part to fill in his story. But then he sort of drew in as much as he could of other things he knew about. Throughout his stories, there are always these little scenes going on in different places in Alexandria, or then there's another part in Cairo and another part in another little area, and often a mixed population wandering around, falling in love, falling out of love, and so on. So there's, it's sort of like the Rome series, these different little stories in different places. And indeed, that's exactly the kind of thing he did, too, is he put in big historical characters, but then he also focused the attention on non-historical characters of his own invention so that he could give them more uniqueness and personality and not still, fly in the face of historical fact. But it was a kind of interweaving of scholarly knowledge and these little stories that he thought would appeal. But they're divided. There were a couple of ones set in the Middle Ages, and then there are a couple of biblical ones, and then there are a bunch of Egyptian ones. And none of them set in classical Greece or Rome at all.
Well, I hope everybody will join me in thanking Professor Marshall.
Thank you very much for coming.